In the brutal hierarchy of shifter politics, silence is usually the only way for an Omega to survive, especially when serving the most dangerous predators on the continent. Maya Lin was just a tired veterinary student trying to pay her tuition, invisible to the monsters in designer suits who ruled her world. She knew the rules. Keep your head down, pour the water, and never make eye contact. But when Alpha Dominic Blackwood, the lethal leader known as the Blood Wolf, began to lose control during a hostile negotiation, Maya didn't run. Exhaustion and instinct overrode her fear. She didn't see a king. She saw a wounded animal needing a steady hand. One slip of the tongue, 3 simple words meant for a golden retriever, shattered the peace. She called the Blood Wolf a good boy. Now, the silence is deafening, and the beast she just tamed is looking at her with a hunger that has nothing to do with diplomacy. Chapter 1. The Boardroom. The air conditioning in the executive boardroom of the Obsidian Shadow Pack was set to a temperature that felt less like a corporate office and more like a morgue, chilling the sweat that had gathered at the nape of Maya Lin's neck. She adjusted the heavy silver tray in her hands, her fingers cramping from gripping the handle too tightly for the last hour. Being invisible was a skill she had perfected over 3 years of working as a server in the pack house, a necessity for a low-ranking Omega with no family connections and a mountain of veterinary school debt. Today, however, invisibility felt impossible. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, rolling off the powerful bodies of the alpha wolves, seated around the mahogany table like waves of heat from a cracked furnace. At the head of the table sat Alpha Dominic Blackwood, a man who took up space even when he wasn't moving. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, but his silence was louder than the shouting match happening across from him. Maya tried not to look at him, but it was hard to ignore the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. He was terrifyingly still, his broad shoulders tensed under a tailored charcoal suit that looked like it was struggling to contain the violence underneath. His scent, a sharp, overwhelming mix of storm, rain, and ozone, was souring, growing heavier with every insult thrown by the visiting delegation. Alpha, Silas Vane, the leader of the rival Iron Claw Pack, seemed determined to push Dominic until he broke. Silas was leaning forward, his voice a grating nasal whine that grated on Maya's already frayed nerves as she moved silently around the perimeter of the room to refill water glasses. Silas chuckled, a wet, ugly sound that made the other wolves at the table stiffen in anticipation of a fight. He tossed a file onto the polished wood, the papers sliding recklessly close to Dominic's clenched fist. He sneered that perhaps the Obsidian Pack had grown soft under Dominic's rule, suggesting that the rumors of Dominic's unstable wolf were not just gossip, but a sign of weakness that needed to be put down. The insult was a death wish. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as a low, vibrating rumble started deep in Dominic's chest. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a tectonic plate shifting before an earthquake, a warning that the man was gone, and the beast was scratching at the door. Maya was standing right beside Dominic when it happened. She saw what the others couldn't see from their seats. His hand, resting on the armrest of his leather chair, was trembling violently, the knuckles white, his fingernails lengthening into jagged claws that dug into the expensive leather. His breathing was ragged, a sign she recognized instantly from her clinical rotations at the vet clinic. It was the physiological response of a dangerous animal backed into a corner, caught between fight and flight, blinded by adrenaline. In that moment, Maya's exhaustion-addled brain short-circuited. She forgot she was a server. She forgot he was the Blood Wolf. She only saw a massive, distressed creature that was about to hurt itself and everyone else if it wasn't grounded immediately. Acting on pure muscle memory from countless hours training skittish rescue dogs, Maya didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped into the danger zone. She placed the water pitcher down with a soft clink and reached out, her small, warm hand covering Dominic's trembling fist. The contact was electric, a shock that should have made her pull back, but she held firm, rubbing her thumb soothingly over the tense tendons of his wrist. She leaned down, her voice dropping into that sweet, melodic register she used for terrified puppies getting their shots. She didn't think. She just spoke. "Easy now," she cooed softly, right into the ear of the most dangerous man in the world. "Breathe. That's a good boy." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was the sudden, horrifying vacuum of sound that happens right before a bomb detonates. Every heart in the room seemed to stop beating at once. Alpha Silas's jaw dropped, his eyes bulging in disbelief. Maya froze, her hand still resting on the Alpha's arm, as the words she had just spoken replayed in her mind, sounding louder and more insane with every passing second. Slowly, terrified to breathe, she looked down. Dominic had stopped shaking. The claws had retracted, but he was slowly turning his head toward her, and when his gaze met hers, his eyes were no longer gray. They were molten, glowing gold. Chapter 2. The Command. The silence in the boardroom stretched so thin that Maya felt it might snap and take her head off with it. She stood frozen, her hand still resting on the forearm of the most lethal predator on the continent, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that she was certain everyone could hear. Alpha Dominic Blackwood stared at her, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that stripped her bare, yet the violent trembling in his limb had ceased completely. It was as if her touch had flipped a circuit breaker, cutting the power to the rage that had been threatening to level the building just moments ago. Across the table, Alpha Silas Vane looked as though he had swallowed a live grenade. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror, not at Dominic's anger, but at the inexplicable calm that had descended over the room. In the world of shifters, for an Omega to command an Alpha was a death sentence. But for an Omega to touch the Blood Wolf without losing a hand was a miracle. Dominic slowly turned his head away from Maya, breaking the trance just long enough to address the room. He didn't shout. He didn't roar. He spoke in a voice that was terrifyingly quiet, a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in the marrow of everyone present. He uttered two simple words that carried the weight of a frantic evacuation order. Get out. It wasn't a suggestion. The reaction was instantaneous. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as the delegation from the Iron Claw Pack scrambled to gather their files, their self-preservation instincts overriding any political posturing. Even Alpha Silas, who had been so eager to pick a fight, looked at the golden fire in Dominic's eyes and decided that today was not the day to die. He backed out of the room with his head bowed, his pack following him in a hasty, undignified retreat. Dominic's own advisors and guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking from their leader to the small, trembling woman standing beside him. But a sharp snarl from Dominic sent them scurrying for the exit. Within 30 seconds, the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, sealing Maya in the air-conditioned tomb with the beast she had just accidentally humiliated. She pulled her hand back as if burned, clutching the silver tray to her chest like a shield, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She expected him to yell, to punish her for her insolence, to fire her on the spot. She braced herself for the impact of his fury. Instead, Dominic rose from his chair. He moved with a predatory grace that made him seem even larger than he was, closing the distance between them in a single stride. Maya backed up until her spine hit the cool wall, trapping her. Dominic planted a hand on the wall beside her head, leaning in until his face was inches from hers. He inhaled deeply, his nose brushing against her jaw, smelling the terror and the lavender soap on her skin. His eyes were still glowing, the wolf very much present. But there was no anger in his expression. There was only a terrifying, possessive hunger. He lowered his head, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered the verdict that would change her life forever. You are mine. Chapter 3. The Diagnosis. Maya barely had time to process the claim before reality tilted on its axis. Dominic didn't give her a chance to argue or even to faint, which was currently her preferred option. He gripped her upper arm, his touch firm but shockingly careful, as if he were handling a piece of antique glass, rather than a lowly member of the pack staff. He steered her toward the private elevator at the back of the boardroom, his body acting as a moving wall that shielded her from the rest of the world. Maya's mind was racing, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of veterinary terminology and sheer panic. She tried to stammer out an apology, to explain that it was a mistake, that she was just tired and thought he was a dog. but the words died in her throat every time she looked up at his rigid jawline. The elevator ride was suffocating, the small space filled with his overwhelming scent of storm rain and cedar, which seemed to have spiked with pheromones that made her knees feel unsteadily weak. When the doors opened, they weren't on the ground floor where the staff lockers were located. They opened directly into the Alpha's private penthouse, a space forbidden to anyone without explicit clearance. Dominic marched her into a sprawling office that smelled of leather and aged whiskey, the floor-to-ceiling windows covered by heavy blackout curtains that plunged the room into perpetual twilight. He sat her down on a plush velvet sofa and then paced away from her, running his hands through his dark hair. Maya, finally having a moment to observe him without the threat of immediate death, let her training kick in. She watched him pace. She noted the way his hands still had a fine tremor, the way his pupils were blown wide despite the dim light, and the sheen of sweat on his forehead. These weren't just signs of anger, they were clinical symptoms. In her classes, they called it sympathetic nervous system overload, but in shifter physiology, it was often a precursor to feral fatigue, a dangerous condition where the human side cracks under the pressure of suppressing the wolf for too long. Dominic wasn't just a tyrant, he was a patient on the brink of a complete physiological collapse. He was suffering from severe touch, starvation, and sensory overload, and his wolf was reacting to the stress by trying to claw its way to the surface. Maya realized with a jolt that her touch in the boardroom hadn't been magic. It had been a grounding wire. She had provided a sensory anchor for a mind that was adrift in chaos. Dominic stopped pacing and turned to look at her, his chest heaving as he fought for control. He looked less like a king and more like a drowning man who had just found a piece of driftwood. He pointed a shaking finger at her, struggling to form a sentence that wasn't a growl. He told her she wasn't leaving. He told her that if she walked out that door, the noise would come back, and he would tear the city apart to make it stop. Chapter 4. The Golden Cage. The concept of being a prisoner in a penthouse suite was something Maya had only read about in trashy romance novels, but the reality was far more unnerving. The door was locked, not with a key, but with a complex biometric scanner that only Dominic could operate. After his declaration, Dominic had retreated into the adjoining bedroom, leaving Maya alone in the dim office to panic about her missed shift and the anatomy exam she had in 2 days. She paced the length of the Persian rug, checking her phone only to find she had zero signal, likely blocked by the security measures embedded in the walls. An hour later, the main door chimed and slid open, revealing a man who looked entirely too calm for the situation. It was Lucas, the Pax Beta, and Dominic's second-in-command, holding a tray of food and a pile of textbooks that looked suspiciously like the ones from her locker downstairs. Lucas didn't look like a jailer. He looked like a tired corporate executive who was relieved someone else was finally dealing with the problem. He set the tray down on the coffee table and offered Maya a sympathetic, albeit amused, smile. He told her to eat, explaining that fainting from low blood sugar wouldn't help anyone, especially not Dominic, who was currently pacing a hole in the floor of his bedroom. Maya demanded to know what was going on, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. She asked why she was being held captive, and if she was going to be punished for what happened in the boardroom. Lucas actually laughed, a dry sound that bounced off the walls. He told her that punishment was the last thing on the agenda. He explained that no one, not even himself, had been able to get Dominic's heart rate under control in 5 years. Lucas sat on the edge of the desk, crossing his arms as he laid out the grim reality of the Obsidian Shadow Pack. He described Dominic's condition not as a sickness, but as a curse of his potency. The Alpha's power was too great for his body to contain without an outlet, and violence had been his only coping mechanism for a decade. Lucas looked at Maya with a seriousness that chilled her blood. He told her that she was the first thing that had ever worked. The pack elders had been debating sedating Dominic heavily, a move that would have left the pack vulnerable to sharks like Silas Vane. Maya wasn't a prisoner, Lucas corrected gently. She was the only thing standing between the Alpha and total psychosis. He gestured to the bedroom door, where a low, muffled whine could be heard, a sound of pure distress. Lucas told her that Dominic didn't want to hurt her, but his wolf was terrified that if she left his sight, the silence she brought with her would vanish forever. Chapter 5. Pavlov's alpha. By the next morning, the dynamic had shifted from terrifying to bizarrely domestic, though the undercurrent of danger remained. Maya had insisted that she could not miss her classes. She had tuition to pay, and she refused to drop out of vet school just because the alpha had developed an emotional support dependency on her. To her surprise, Dominic didn't argue. He simply stated that he would take her. The compromise, however, involved him driving her in his heavily armored SUV, a vehicle that cost more than her entire life's earnings. As they navigated the morning gridlock of the city, the atmosphere inside the car was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dominic gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds, scanning for threats that weren't there. The traffic was a nightmare, a sea of honking horns and aggressive drivers that seemed to grate on Dominic's last nerve. A red sedan cut them off abruptly, forcing Dominic to slam on the brakes. The sudden stop threw them forward, and a growl ripped from Dominic's throat, deep and feral. His eyes began to flash that dangerous gold again, and the leather of the steering wheel creaked under his grip as if it were about to snap. Maya saw the signs instantly. The tension in his jaw, the rapid breathing, the way the air in the car suddenly felt charged with static. He was slipping. The wolf was reacting to the aggression of the traffic as a challenge, and he was seconds away from exiting the vehicle and tearing the other driver's car apart with his bare hands. Maya knew she had to act. She didn't have a water pitcher this time, but she had the theory she had been formulating all night. If this was a behavioral response, it could be interrupted. She reached across the center console, ignoring the way his energy snapped at her skin, and placed her hand flat on his thigh. The contact made him flinch, his head whipping toward her with a snarl that died halfway up his throat. She held his gaze, keeping her face perfectly calm, masking her fear with professional detachment. She lowered her voice to that same soothing, melodic pitch she had used in the boardroom. She told him to leave it. She praised him for holding back. She told him he was doing so well. The effect was hypnotic. Dominic's shoulders dropped 3 inches. The gold faded from his irises, replaced by a dazed, heavy-lidded gray. He leaned into her touch, essentially melting into the passenger seat. In that moment, the terrifying realization hit Maya. She wasn't just an anchor. She held the leash to a monster, and he liked it. Chapter 6. The Scent of Lavender. Nightfall in the Alpha's penthouse brought a different kind of heaviness to the air, a thick silence that amplified every breath and rustle of fabric. Maya stood by the edge of the massive king-sized bed, clutching a pillow to her chest like a life raft, unsure of the protocol for sleeping with a man who could snap her spine with a sneeze. Dominic had made it clear that separate rooms were not an option. His wolf was still too close to the surface, pacing just beneath his skin, and the mere suggestion of her sleeping down the hall had caused his pupils to dilate into black voids of panic. He needed to hear her heart beating. It was the only metronome that kept his own rhythm steady. So, Maya found herself wearing an oversized t-shirt that smelled of his detergent, trying to make herself as small as possible on the far left side of the mattress, while Dominic prowled the room, checking the locks on the windows for the 5th time. When he finally settled into the bed, the mattress dipped significantly under his weight, pulling Maya slightly toward him. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his body radiating a heat that felt like a fever. Maya tried to close her eyes, to force herself into the sleep she so desperately needed. But the tension radiating off him was palpable. He was vibrating again, that low-frequency tremor that signaled his control was slipping. It wasn't aggression this time. It was pure, unadulterated insomnia born of vigilance. He had spent so many years guarding his pack, guarding himself, that the concept of rest was foreign to his physiology. He shifted, a frustrated growl rumbling in his chest, and turned his head to look at her. In the darkness, his eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting the predator within. He didn't speak, but his hand moved across the sheets, his fingers twitching as they stopped inches from her arm. He was asking for permission, a silent plea from a creature that was starving for contact but terrified of breaking the only fragile thing that mattered. Maya sighed, recognizing the pattern. She rolled onto her side, facing him, and bridged the gap. She placed her hand on his cheek, feeling the rough stubble and the hot skin beneath. Dominic flinched initially, then pressed into her palm with a desperation that broke her heart. She moved her hand up, burying her fingers in his thick, dark hair, and began to scratch gently at his scalp, using the same rhythmic, repetitive motion she used to calm anxious patients coming out of anesthesia. The effect was immediate. Dominic let out a long, shuddering breath, his heavy eyelids fluttering shut. His massive body, which had been coiled tight as a spring, began to unravel. He shuffled closer, wrapping a heavy arm around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck to inhale the lavender scent of her skin. It wasn't sexual. It was survival. As Maya continued to stroke his hair, murmuring soft, meaningless praises into the dark, the most feared alpha on the continent finally allowed himself to surrender to the vulnerability of sleep. Chapter 7. The Veterinary Exam. The next afternoon, the penthouse living room had been transformed into a makeshift study hall, with anatomy textbooks, skeletal diagrams, and flashcards scattered across the expensive coffee table. Maya sat cross-legged on the floor, chewing on the end of a highlighter as she tried to memorize the cranial nerves of the canine species. It was a surreal juxtaposition studying the biology of wolves while a real-life werewolf paced circles around her, emanating waves of boredom and irritation. Dominic had taken the day off from pack business to supervise her, which mostly involved him glaring at her textbooks as if they were personal rivals for her attention. He didn't understand why she needed to focus on paper diagrams when he was right there, a living, breathing specimen of everything she was trying to learn. Every time she turned a page, he let out a dramatic, huffing sigh, seeking to draw her gaze back to him. After the 10th heavy sigh, Maya slapped her book shut and looked up at him. He was leaning against the fireplace, arms crossed, looking distinctly sulky for a man who commanded an army. She realized that trying to ignore him was futile. He was like a high-energy working breed that hadn't been walked in days. If she didn't give him a task or attention, he was going to start chewing the furniture or, in this case, her patience. She decided to improvise. Beckoning him over, she told him to sit on the floor in front of her. Dominic hesitated, his eyebrows shooting up at the direct command. But the curiosity and the chance to be close to her won out. He moved with fluid grace, settling down on the rug, his long legs stretching out on either side of her. Maya told him to stay still, then reached out and traced the line of his clavicle, reciting the Latin name for the bone aloud. Dominic went rigid at her touch, his breath hitching, but he didn't pull away. Maya continued, her fingers moving down his arm, tracing the heavy scarring that marred his skin, evidence of countless battles and challenges. She turned the study session into a tactile examination, naming the muscles as her fingers brushed over his biceps and forearms. What started as an academic exercise quickly shifted into something heavier. Dominic watched her with intense, darkened eyes, tracking the movement of her hands as if she were painting fire onto his skin. When her fingers lingered on a particularly jagged scar near his elbow, his voice dropped to a rough whisper, explaining that he got that one from a rogue alpha 3 winters ago. Maya looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw the raw hunger there. It wasn't just about the physical sensation, it was the intimacy of being known, of having his scars acknowledged not as weaknesses, but as history. The air in the room grew thick and charged, the textbooks forgotten on the floor as the alpha leaned in, silently demanding she stop studying the dead and start paying attention to the living. Chapter 8. The Rival Returns. The fragile domestic bubble they had created popped violently the following morning with a sharp knock on the door. Lucas entered, his usual expression of bored detachment replaced by a grim tightness around his mouth. He carried a tablet that displayed a map of the pack's northern borders, marked with flashing red indicators. The news was bad. Alpha Silas Vane, humiliated and seeking retribution, had been busy. He hadn't attacked directly. Instead, he had weaponized the gossip mill. Rumors were spreading through the neighboring territories like wildfire, claiming that the blood wolf had been neutered by a witch, that Dominic was soft, weak, and controlled by a mere Omega. Sensing blood in the water, a group of nomadic rogues, likely paid by Silas, had breached the northern perimeter to test the pack's defenses. It was a direct challenge to Dominic's authority, one that required an immediate and brutal response. Dominic's reaction was terrifying. The calm, touch-starved man who had let Maya pet his hair the night before vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the cold, lethal warlord she had first met in the boardroom. He stood by the window, staring out at the forest, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the claws that were threatening to tear through his skin. The air pressure in the room dropped as his aura flared, heavy and suffocating. He had to go. He had to remind the world why they feared the name Blackwood. But the conflict within him was visible. He kept glancing back at Maya, his eyes wild with separation anxiety. His wolf was screaming that leaving her was a mistake, that she was unsafe without him, that the distance would break the tenuous control he had just regained. Maya walked up behind him, sensing the war waging in his mind. She didn't try to stop him. She knew the politics of their world enough to know that a challenge unanswered was a kingdom lost. Instead, she reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against the tension in his back. She felt the vibration of his growl against her chest. She told him to go. She told him to handle business and come back to her. It was the permission his wolf needed, a promise that she would be there when the dust settled. Dominic turned in her arms, gripping her shoulders with bruising force, his forehead resting against hers. He made her swear she wouldn't leave the penthouse, wouldn't open the door for anyone but Lucas. His voice was a ragged scrap of sound, desperate and fierce. He promised to burn the world down if anyone touched her while he was gone, and then, with one last, searing look, he stormed out, leaving the silence of the room feeling louder than a scream. Chapter 9. Good girl. It was hours past midnight when the biometric lock on the penthouse door beeped, signaling his return. Maya had been pacing the living room floor, unable to sleep, her mind conjuring horrific images of what was happening at the border. When the door slid open, the smell hit her first, the metallic tang of fresh blood, mixed with the damp scent of rain and heavy musk. Dominic stood in the doorway, and he looked like a nightmare brought to life. His shirt was in tatters, hanging off his frame in wet strips, and his skin was painted in streaks of crimson that wasn't his own. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull, water dripping down his face to mix with the blood on his chest. He was vibrating with adrenaline, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing a solid, luminous gold that showed no trace of humanity. He stepped into the room, and the energy he brought with him was violent and chaotic. The fight had ended, but the beast was still in the driver's seat, high on violence and the thrill of the kill. He scanned the room wildly until his gaze landed on Maya. He let out a low, menacing sound that was half growl, half purr, and started toward her. He wasn't attacking, but his movements were jerky, predatory, lacking the careful restraint he usually exercised around her. He was too revved up, too lost in the instinct to claim and conquer. Maya's heart hammered in her throat. She knew that running would trigger his chase instinct, and cowering would insult him. She had to meet the monster head-on. She squared her shoulders, standing her ground in the center of the room as the blood-soaked giant bore down on her. When he was 2 steps away, looming over her like a collapsing building, Maya raised her hand, palm out, fingers splayed. Her voice was steady, cutting through the haze of his bloodlust like a whip crack. She commanded him to sit. The order hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Dominic froze, his head cocked to the side, confusion battling with instinct. The conditioning she had accidentally installed in him sparked. His muscles twitched, fighting the command, but the bond demanded obedience to the one thing that brought him peace. Slowly, trembling with the effort, the massive alpha dropped to his knees before her. He looked up, his breathing ragged, waiting for the next instruction. Maya stepped closer, ignoring the blood, and placed her hand on his wet hair. She looked down at him, her eyes softening as she whispered the words that sealed his submission. "Good boy." The tension snapped, and Dominic slumped forward, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her stomach, surrendering his control to the only person strong enough to hold it. Chapter 10. The pack dinner. 2 days after the border incident, the immediate physical danger had passed, only to be replaced by a social minefield that terrified Maya far more than any rogue wolf. It was the night of the quarterly pack dinner, a formal event where the elders and high-ranking families gathered to discuss policy and, implicitly, to judge the Alpha's leadership. Dominic had insisted Maya attend by his side, not as a server, but as his guest. He had dressed her in a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than her parents' house, but no amount of expensive fabric could hide the fact that she was an Omega stepping into a den of apex predators. The dining hall was a cavernous space lit by crystal chandeliers, filled with people who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. To them, she was a temporary fascination, a pet the Alpha would eventually tire of. The dinner started well enough, with Dominic acting as a silent, brooding shield beside her, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. However, the peace was shattered during the second course by Elder Thorne, a man with gray hair and outdated views on hierarchy. He looked down his nose at Maya, swirling his wine glass, and loudly remarked on how quaint it was that Dominic had brought his little nursemaid to the table, suggesting that perhaps she should be clearing the plates rather than eating off them. The table went deadly silent. Beside her, Dominic went rigid, his fork bending under the pressure of his grip. The air began to crackle with the familiar static of his rage. He was seconds away from tearing Thorne's throat out, a move that would spark a civil war within the pack. Maya knew she had to intervene. She placed a calming hand on Dominic's forearm, stopping him from rising. She turned to Elder Thorne, offering him a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile she had perfected while dealing with difficult clients at the vet clinic who refused to pay their bills. She kept her voice sweet, polite, and loud enough for the entire table to hear. She thanked him for his concern, noting that considering how often the high-ranking wolves seemed to get injured due to incompetence, having a medical professional at the head table was actually a strategic necessity, not a luxury. She added that she would be happy to examine his eyesight later, as he seemed to be having trouble seeing the reality of the situation. Thorne sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. A few stifled chuckles broke out around the table. Dominic relaxed back into his chair, a smirk touching his lips as he looked at her with a blazing pride. She hadn't just survived the test. She had bitten back. Chapter 11. Instinct versus Logic. The truce between Maya's independence and Dominic's possessiveness was fragile at best, held together by a thin thread of compromise that finally snapped on a rainy Tuesday. The catalyst was a mandatory study group for her pathology final, which was being held at the university library, a location that Dominic deemed unsecured and tactically indefensible. The argument in the penthouse had been loud and circular. Dominic had insisted that he could hire the best professors in the country to come to her, but Maya had dug her heels in, refusing to be treated like a porcelain doll in a glass cabinet. She needed to feel normal, even if just for a few hours. She needed to be Maya the student, not Maya the Alpha's pet. Eventually, Dominic had gone terrifyingly quiet and let her leave, though the look in his eyes promised that the conversation was far from over. The library was quiet, smelling of old paper and floor wax, a sanctuary that usually calmed Maya's nerves. She was huddled at a corner table with her lab partner, a lanky human named Ben, who was nervously tapping his pen against his textbook. They were 40 minutes into reviewing cellular degeneration when the atmosphere in the room shifted. The temperature seemed to drop, and the hairs on Maya's arms stood up in a primal warning response. Ben stopped tapping his pen, looking around with a frown, rubbing his arms as if a draft had just swept through the stacks. Maya didn't need to look up to know what had happened. She could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of a predator's gaze settling on the back of her neck. She turned slowly toward the darkened rows of fiction behind them. Standing in the shadows of the bookshelves, perfectly still and utterly terrifying, was Dominic. He hadn't just dropped her off. He had stalked her. He was leaning against a stack of classic literature, his dark suit blending into the gloom, his eyes fixed on Ben with a look that suggested he was calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to dismantle the poor boy. Ben followed Maya's gaze and let out a strangled squeak of terror, dropping his pen. He didn't know who Dominic was, but human instinct recognized a monster when it saw one. Maya flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fury. She slammed her book shut, marched over to the Alpha, and dragged him by the sleeve into the stairwell. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Maya accused him of treating her like a prisoner, of suffocating her. Dominic didn't apologize. He backed her against the concrete wall, his voice a low rumble, telling her that she didn't understand the target on her back. He admitted that his wolf couldn't handle the distance, that every minute she was out of his sight felt like physical pain. He wasn't trying to control her life. He was trying to keep his own sanity intact. Chapter 12. The Compromise. The drive back to the pack house was conducted in a stony silence that felt heavier than the armored doors of the vehicle. Maya stared out the window, her heart aching with the realization that her two worlds were incompatible. She couldn't be a normal student while mated to a paranormal warlord, but she refused to be a bird in a gilded cage. When they arrived, Dominic didn't take her back to the penthouse. Instead, he drove the SUV around the back of the main estate to a clearing near the edge of the forest where a construction crew was already breaking ground. Heavy machinery roared, and wolves in hard hats were moving with efficient purpose. Maya looked at Dominic, confused by the detour. He turned off the engine and looked at her, his expression guarded, stripping away the arrogance to reveal a man desperate to find a solution. He handed her a rolled-up set of blueprints. Maya unrolled them, her eyes widening as she realized what she was looking at. It wasn't a garage or a guest house. It was a fully equipped, state-of-the-art veterinary clinic and research facility, Dominic explained, his voice devoid of its usual command, that he couldn't let her go into the city alone because the risk was too high. But he wouldn't ask her to give up her dream. If she couldn't go to the clinic, he would bring the clinic to the pack. He was building it for her. It would be hers to run, staffed by her, open to both pack animals and local wildlife. It was a gesture so grand, so ridiculously extravagant, that it knocked the air from her lungs. This was his compromise, a multi-million-dollar facility built on the premise that he just wanted her close. But there was a catch. Dominic watched her reaction carefully before dropping the second condition. He would build her the world. But in exchange, she had to accept her place in his. The blood moon was approaching in 2 weeks, the traditional night of the mating run. He needed her to participate. He needed the pack to see her run, not as a victim, but as his choice. He needed to claim her publicly, irrevocably, under the light of the moon, to cement her status and protect her from challenges. It was a terrifying prospect, an archaic ritual of chase and capture, but looking at the blueprints, and then at the hopeful, guarded look in his golden eyes, Maya realized she was done fighting the inevitable. She reached out, taking his large hand in hers, and squeezed. She agreed to the run. For the first time, she smiled at him without fear, whispering that he was a good boy for trying so hard. The endearment didn't make him flinch this time. Instead, a flush of color rose on his cheekbones, and he looked at her with a devotion that bordered on worship. Chapter 13. As the days ticked down toward the blood moon, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from domestic tension to a thick, suffocating heat. It wasn't just the weather. It was the biological imperative of the mate bond reacting to the lunar cycle. The pre-mating fever hit Dominic first, stripping away his civilized layers hour by hour. He became clingy, his movements sluggish and heavy, his eyes perpetually dilated. He couldn't stand to be more than 3 feet away from Maya. If she went to the kitchen for water, he was right behind her, pressing his chest to her back, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent like it was the only oxygen in the room. The air around them crackled with static electricity, snapping against their skin whenever they touched. Maya wasn't immune either. Her body ached with a strange, hollow longing. Her senses heightened to the point where the sound of his breathing from across the room made her heart skip. But for Dominic, it was agony. His wolf was clawing at the surface, demanding the completion of the bond. One evening, the tension reached a boiling point. Dominic was pacing the living room, a low growl constant in his chest, his skin burning to the touch. He looked like he was in physical pain, his muscles coiled so tight they might snap. Maya, guided by instinct and the strange new rhythm of their shared heartbeat, knew exactly what he needed. She didn't retreat. She sat on the edge of the sofa and called him to her. He came instantly, collapsing to his knees between her legs, resting his head on her lap with a shuddering groan. He was the most powerful creature she had ever known. Yet here he was, trembling, begging for her touch to ground him. Maya ran her fingers through his damp hair, scratching his scalp, massaging the tension from his neck. She spoke to him in that low, crooning voice, telling him he was doing well, praising his restraint. Every time she called him a good boy, a visible ripple of pleasure went through him. He confessed, his voice rough and broken, that the praise quieted the noise in his head. He needed her validation more than he needed air. He needed to know that his beast was accepted, that he wasn't just a monster to her. It was a moment of profound intimacy, far more intense than any physical act, as Maya realized that her power over him wasn't magic, it was simply love, given freely to a creature who had never known it. Chapter 14. The Breach. The fever broke, momentarily, with the shattering sound of glass. It was 3 a.m, the darkest part of the night, when the silent alarms on the perimeter fence should have triggered. They didn't. The security system, designed by the best military minds and reinforced with pack magic, remained dormant. The only warning came from Dominic himself. He shot up in bed, his eyes flying open, instantly shifting from deep sleep to lethal alertness. He roared a warning, tackling Maya, and rolling them both off the mattress just as the bedroom window exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down on the duvet where they had been sleeping seconds before, followed by canisters that hissed as they hit the floor, spewing thick, acrid smoke into the room. Coughing, Dominic dragged Maya into the ensuite bathroom, slamming the heavy reinforced door and locking it. He was moving on pure adrenaline, his body shifting partially, claws lengthening, teeth elongating. He shoved a wet towel into her hands and told her to cover her face. The smoke was wolfsbane, a neurotoxin designed to paralyze shifters. It meant one thing. They had been betrayed. Someone on the inside, someone with high-level clearance, had disabled the wards and let the enemy right to their doorstep. The realization turned Dominic's fear into a cold, murderous rage. He checked the bathroom window, which was too small for him but big enough for Maya. He turned to her, gripping her shoulders, his golden eyes burning through the haze. He told her she had to climb out, get to the roof, and hide. He had to go back out there and hold them off. Maya grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin, refusing to let go. She argued that he couldn't go out there alone, not with wolfsbane in the air, not when he was already weakened by the mating fever. But the sounds of heavy boots kicking at the bedroom door cut her argument short. There was no time. Dominic kissed her hard, a desperate, bruising claim of a kiss that tasted of fear and goodbye. He told her to run, to find Lucas, and then he turned and ripped the bathroom door open, throwing himself into the smoke-filled bedroom with a roar that shook the foundations of the building. Maya didn't wait to watch him die. She scrambled through the small window onto the narrow ledge, the cold night air biting at her skin, as the sounds of a brutal, close-quarters fight erupted behind her. Chapter 15. The Healer's Hands. The chaos outside the pack house was absolute. The infiltration wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a full-scale raid. Rogues were swarming the grounds, clashing with the Obsidian enforcers who were scrambling to organize a defense. Maya made it to the ground level by sliding down a trellis, her hands scraped and bleeding, her silk pajamas torn. She didn't run for the woods. She ran toward the sound of screaming. The infirmary was located in the east wing, and that was where the battle seemed thickest. When she burst through the double doors, the scene was a nightmare. The pack doctor was down, unconscious or dead, and 3 young enforcers were bleeding out on the gurneys, surrounded by panicked staff who didn't know what to do. Fear vanished, replaced by the cold, clinical detachment of her training. Maya didn't see wolves or monsters. She saw patients in critical distress. She shouted for order, her voice cracking like a whip over the panic. She rushed to the nearest wolf, a young boy named Toby whose throat had been slashed. He was shifting in and out of his human form, his body unable to decide how to heal, which was making the blood loss worse. Maya grabbed a clamp and a suture kit. She ordered a massive, terrified warrior standing nearby to hold Toby down. She didn't ask. She commanded. The warrior obeyed instantly. For the next 20 minutes, Maya was a whirlwind of efficiency. She packed wounds, stitched arteries, and administered adrenaline, her hands steady despite the explosions rocking the building. She was covered in blood up to her elbows, her face smeared with grime, but she didn't stop. When a rogue wolf burst into the infirmary, snarling and ready to kill, the warrior she had ordered around earlier didn't hesitate. He threw himself in front of Maya, taking the hit, meant for her, ripping the rogue's throat out in a spray of gore. He turned back to her, breathless and bloody, and nodded. It was a moment of recognition. She wasn't just the alpha's mate to them anymore. She wasn't an outsider or a weakness. She was the one keeping their kin alive. She was the pack healer. Maya wiped the sweat from her eyes, nodded back, and moved to the next patient. The alpha might be fighting for their territory, but she was fighting for their lives. Chapter 16. The Abduction. The adrenaline that had fueled Maya's triage efforts in the infirmary began to wane, leaving behind a cold, trembling exhaustion. The immediate chaos of the attack seemed to be subsiding, the sounds of battle drifting further away toward the perimeter walls where Dominic and the enforcers were pushing back the rogue wave. Maya wiped her blood-slicked hands on a clean towel, taking a moment to breathe as the pack doctor, now conscious and groggy, took over the suturing of a young warrior. She felt a surge of pride. They had held the line. She had saved lives. But as she turned to check the inventory of bandages in the supply closet, the hair on her arm stood up, signaling a danger far more insidious than the chaotic violence outside. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy and still, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by a sudden vacuum. The double doors at the far end of the ward didn't burst open with the force of a raid. They swung open silently, admitting 3 figures clad in tactical gear that bore no rogue markings. These were professionals, moving with a synchronized lethality that froze the room. In the center stood a man. Maya recognized from the dossiers Dominic had shown her Beta Kale, Silas Vane's right hand. He wasn't looking at the injured wolves or the valuable medical equipment. His cold, pale eyes locked onto Maya with the precision of a laser sight. It dawned on her with sickening clarity that the rogues at the wall, the smoke bombs, the chaos, it was all an elaborate diversion. They hadn't come for territory. They hadn't come to kill the alpha. They had come for her. Maya backed up, her hand closing around a scalpel on the metal tray behind her. She shouted for the guards, but the 2 enforcers remaining in the room dropped to the floor before they could shift, darts protruding from their necks. Kale moved faster than humanly possible, closing the distance between them before Maya could even raise her weapon. She slashed out, desperate and terrified. But he caught her wrist in a crushing grip, twisting until the scalpel clattered to the floor. He didn't waste time with taunts. He simply jammed a syringe into the side of her neck. The world tilted sideways instantly. The sterile white of the infirmary dissolved into a blur of gray and black. As her legs gave out and she was hoisted over a massive shoulder like a sack of grain, her last conscious thought wasn't of fear for herself, but a heartbreaking realization of what this would do to Dominic. She tried to whisper his name, to send a warning down the bond. But the darkness swallowed her whole before the sound could leave her lips. Chapter 17. Silence in the bond. Dominic stood amidst the carnage at the northern gate, his chest heaving as the last of the rogue wolves fell beneath his claws. The rain had washed away the smoke, leaving the air crisp and smelling of iron and wet earth. The victory was decisive. The attackers had been disorganized, weak. barely a challenge for the Obsidian elites. But instead of the rush of triumph, a sudden, icy hollowness expanded in Dominic's chest. It started as a flicker of unease and rapidly grew into a gaping void. For weeks, the mate bond had been a humming live wire in the back of his mind, a constant stream of Maya's emotions, her fear, her determination, her warmth. Now, there was nothing. It was as if a radio had been abruptly unplugged, leaving only dead air and static. He froze, his claws still extended, ignoring the beta who was approaching with a status report. He reached out mentally, pushing against the silence, screaming her name into the void of the connection. There was no answer. The silence was deafening. A physical blow that staggered him more than any physical wound could. He spun around, his golden eyes wide and frantic, scanning the compound. The infirmary. He took off running, a blur of motion that left his guards scrambling to catch up. He didn't need to see the empty room to know the truth. He could taste the lingering scent of an intruder, a foreign musk that didn't belong to the rogues. It was the scent of the Ironclaw pack. When Dominic arrived at the infirmary and saw the scalpel on the floor and the unconscious guards, the man who had been learning to be gentle, to be a good boy, ceased to exist. A roar tore from his throat that shattered the windows of the medical wing, a sound of such raw, agonizing loss that seasoned warriors covered their ears. Lucas arrived seconds later, dragging a trembling man in a security uniform, the traitor who had lowered the wards. Dominic didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for a trial. He descended on the traitor with the fury of a natural disaster. It took 3 high-ranking enforcers and Lucas to physically restrain him from tearing the man into unrecognizable scraps before they could get the location of the extraction point. Dominic threw them off, his body vibrating with a lethal energy. His eyes were no longer gold, they were black pits of annihilation. He turned to Lucas, his voice a distorted demonic growl. He commanded them to ready the war vehicles. They were not going to negotiate. They were going to burn the Ironclaw territory to the ground and salt the earth. Chapter 18. The Cage. Consciousness returned to Maya in a slow, throbbing wave of pain. The sterile smell of the clinic was gone, replaced by the damp, moldy stench of stagnant water and old stone. She shivered, the cold seeping through her torn silk pajamas, and tried to sit up. She was on a cot in a small, windowless cell, the only light coming from a flickering bulb in the hallway beyond the iron bars. Her head swam from the tranquilizer, but the panic that surged through her was sharp and immediate. She scrambled to the bars, gripping the cold metal, peering out into the gloom. Footsteps echoed on the concrete, slow and deliberate, announcing the arrival of her captor. Alpha Silas Vane appeared in the light, looking smug and untouched by the violence he had orchestrated. He held a cane in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against the floor. He stopped in front of her cell, studying her like a particularly interesting lab specimen. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He told her that he had been watching her, studying the reports. He wanted to know how a weak, powerless Omega had brought the Bloodwolf to his knees. He was convinced she possessed some kind of dormant magic, a siren voice that could enslave alphas. He demanded a demonstration. He signaled to a guard, who stepped forward and unlocked the cell door, entering with a menacing leer. Silas ordered Maya to use her voice to stop the guard. Maya backed into the corner, terror clawing at her throat. She tried to explain that there was no magic, that it was just a phrase, just a relationship based on trust. But Silas wouldn't listen. He barked an order, and the guard lunged. Maya screamed, dodging the first blow, but the guard was faster and stronger. He backhanded her, the force of the blow sending her crashing into the stone wall. Pain exploded in her jaw, and she tasted copper. She slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Silas looked disappointed, sneering that perhaps she needed more motivation. He raised his hand to signal another strike. Maya looked up, spitting blood onto the dirty floor. She glared at Silas with a hatred that burned hotter than fear. She told him he was a fool. She told him that Dominic didn't submit because of magic. He submitted because he was loved. something a monster like Silas would never understand. The realization hit Silas that he had abducted a useless girl, but the fear in his eyes when he realized who was coming for her was the only victory Maya needed. Chapter 19. The Hunt. The forest between the Obsidian Territory and the Iron Claw stronghold was a blur of shadows and moonlight, passing in a streak of gray and green. Dominic was no longer driving a vehicle. He had abandoned the SUV miles back when the terrain became too rough. He was running on 4 legs, a massive, midnight black wolf larger than any natural predator. His paws tore into the earth, leaving deep gouges in the soil as he propelled himself forward with a speed that defied physics. He was not thinking in words or plans. His mind had fractured into a singular, obsessed drive. The human part of him was buried deep, screaming in the dark, while the beast was in full control, guided by the faint, fading scent of lavender that lingered on the wind. Every mile he crossed fueled his rage. He could smell her fear imprinted on the air, a trail of breadcrumbs leading him straight to hell. His muscles burned, his lungs heaved, but he felt none of it. The separation was a physical agony, a tearing of his soul that could only be mended by blood. He replayed the image of the empty infirmary over and over, using the pain to sharpen his focus. He wasn't just coming to rescue a mate. He was coming to reclaim a part of his own body. The forest creatures scattered as he passed, sensing the aura of death that clung to him. He was a wraith, a shadow of vengeance moving through the night. As the fortress of the Iron Claw Pack came into view, a brutalist structure of concrete and steel nestled against a cliff face, Dominic didn't slow down to assess the defenses. He didn't wait for Lucas and the heavy assault team following in the armored carriers. Strategy was for men who had something to lose. Dominic had already lost his anchor. He let out a howl that wasn't a call for backup, but a promise of extinction. It rolled over the valley, shaking the trees and chilling the blood of the sentries on the walls. He hit the perimeter fence at full speed, his momentum and strength shearing through the metal mesh as if it were paper. The alarms began to wail, piercing the night, but they were too late. The blood wolf was inside, and he would not stop until the rivers ran red, or he held her in his arms again. Chapter 20. The Rescue. The infiltration of the Iron Claw stronghold was not a battle, it was a massacre. Dominic moved through the corridors like a storm, a whirlwind of claws and teeth that left nothing but ruin in his wake. Bullets grazed his flank, guards attacked with shock batons, but nothing slowed him down. He absorbed the pain and converted it into violence. He tore through reinforced doors, threw fully grown men through walls, and left a trail of broken bodies that marked his path to the dungeons. The scent of her blood, fresh, metallic, terrified, hit him when he reached the stairwell, and it snapped the last thread of his sanity. He descended the stairs in a frenzy, the growl in his chest loud enough to vibrate the stones. He reached the heavy iron door of the detention block and didn't bother with the lock. He rammed it with his shoulder, the hinges screaming as the metal buckled and gave way. He burst into the hallway, his golden eyes scanning wildly until they landed on the open cell at the end. He saw Silas Vane cowering in the corner. He saw the guard standing over a small, crumpled figure on the floor. And then he saw her. Maya was curled against the wall, her face swollen, blood dripping from her lip onto her torn pajamas. The sight of her injury triggered a psychotic break. The world went red. Dominic didn't just attack the guard, he obliterated him in a blur of motion so fast the eye couldn't track it. He tossed the body aside like a rag doll and turned his gaze on Silas. The rival Alpha tried to speak, tried to beg, but Dominic was beyond language. He was a creature of pure retribution. He advanced on Silas, ready to tear him limb from limb, to make him suffer for every drop of blood Maya had shed. He was vibrating with a lethal energy that threatened to bring the ceiling down on top of them. He was going to kill Silas. Then he was going to kill everyone else in the building. And he might not stop there. He was lost to the rage, drowning in it, his claws lengthened and ready to strike the final, fatal blow. Chapter 21. The Anchor. The dungeon was vibrating with the sheer force of Alpha Dominic Blackwood's unbridled rage. He stood over the cowering form of Alpha Silas Vane, his chest heaving like a bellows, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the immense effort it was taking to hold back the killing blow for just one more second. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and imminent death. Lucas and the Obsidian enforcers had breached the room moments ago, weapons drawn, but they froze at the threshold. They knew that stepping between a feral alpha and his target was suicide. Dominic was gone. The man who had carefully built a clinic for his mate, who had learned to breathe through the anger, had been consumed by the blood wolf. His eyes were black voids, seeing nothing but the enemy who had touched what was his. He raised his hand, claws gleaming in the dim light, ready to separate Silas's head from his shoulders. Dominic! The name was barely a whisper, a broken rasp of sound that should have been drowned out by the growls and the shouting. But it cut through the red haze of his mind like a church bell. Dominic froze, his arms suspended in the air. His body shuddered violently, fighting the momentum of the kill. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head. Maya had pulled herself up from the floor. She was swaying on her feet, clutching her bruised ribs, her face a mask of pain and blood. But her eyes were clear. She wasn't looking at the monster with fear. She was looking at him with an overwhelming, heartbreaking tenderness. She took a step toward him, ignoring Lucas's shouted warning to stay back. She took another step, entering the kill zone, placing herself directly between the predator and his prey. Dominic snarled, a warning sound that rumbled deep in his chest, trying to push her away, trying to tell her he was too dangerous to be near. He was covered in the blood of a dozen men, a nightmare made flesh. Maya didn't flinch. She reached up with trembling hands and cupped his face, her thumbs stroking over the gore-streaked cheekbones. She forced him to look at her, to see the life in her eyes, to realize she was still there, still whole. "Look at me," she commanded softly, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "It's over." Dominic's breathing hitched, the black in his eyes swirling, fighting a war against the returning gold. He was teetering on the edge of a cliff, the abyss of insanity pulling him down. Maya leaned her forehead against his chest, right over his thundering heart. She wrapped her arms around his waist and whispered the only words that mattered. "Dominic, good boy." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The tension left his body as if his strings had been cut. The claws retracted. The murderous aura evaporated, leaving behind a man shattered by relief. He collapsed, his knees hitting the concrete with a thud, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He shook uncontrollably, clutching her to him as if she were a ghost, making a low, keen sound of desperation. Silas took the opportunity to scramble away, but Lucas stepped forward, a cold smile on his face, and knocked the rival Alpha unconscious with the butt of his rifle. The threat was neutralized, but the war in the room was over. Dominic Blackwood, the scourge of the North, was on his knees in a dungeon, weeping silently into the hair of the woman who held his leash. Chapter 22. The True Mating. The extraction had been a blur of tactical precision, but the return to the Obsidian pack house was a solemn procession. Dominic had refused to let anyone else touch Maya. He had carried her out of the stronghold himself, his face set in a grim mask of self-hatred, and had held her in the back of the armored transport the entire way home. Now, in the safety of the penthouse master bedroom, the silence was heavy with unspoken words. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, freshly showered and wearing one of Dominic's clean shirts, while the pack doctor finished tending to the bruising on her face. Dominic stood by the window, staring out at the dark forest, his back rigid. He looked like a man awaiting execution. When the doctor left, closing the door with a soft click, Dominic finally spoke. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence. He didn't turn around. He told her that he had failed. He had promised to protect her, and instead, she had been taken, beaten, and nearly killed because of his enemies. He told her that she should leave. He said he was too dangerous, too unstable, and that the violence he carried inside him would eventually destroy her. He was giving her an out, a chance to run far away from the world of shifters and blood feuds. He gripped the window frame until the wood cracked, waiting for her to agree. To pack her bags and save herself. Maya stood up, ignoring the ache in her ribs. She walked across the room and stopped directly behind him. She didn't touch him yet. She asked him if he was done feeling sorry for himself. Dominic whipped around, stunned by the steel in her voice. He opened his mouth to argue, but she silenced him with a look. She told him that she didn't want a safe life. She wanted him. She told him that he hadn't failed. He had come for her when no one else could. She stepped closer, closing the distance, and placed her hands on his chest. She could feel his heart hammering against her palms. She told him that he had claimed her in the boardroom when she was weak, but now it was her turn. She pushed him back until his legs hit the edge of the bed, and he sat down heavily, looking up at her with wide, vulnerable eyes. Maya straddled his lap, cupping his face. She tilted his head to the side, exposing the thick column of his neck, the place where the mating gland pulsed with a frantic rhythm. Dominic froze, realizing what she was about to do. He tried to pull back, whispering that he wasn't worthy, that he would taint her. Maya didn't listen. She leaned in, her lips brushing the sensitive skin, and whispered back, "You don't get to decide that. You belong to me now." With a surge of fierce possessiveness, she sank her teeth into the junction of his neck and shoulder. The bite broke the skin, and the bond snapped into place with the force of a supernova, permanent, unbreakable, and absolute. Dominic roared, his hands gripping her hips as their souls fused together, finally silencing the darkness in his mind for good. Chapter 23. The Luna Ascendant. The weeks following the fall of the Iron Claw Pack were a whirlwind of political restructuring and reconstruction. With Silas Vane dead, executed by the Council for his crimes, his territory was absorbed into the Obsidian Domain, making Dominic the most powerful alpha in history. But the true shift in power wasn't measured in land or soldiers. It was happening inside the packhouse walls. The morning of the first Grand Council meeting since the war was tense. The elders were gathered at the long mahogany table, muttering amongst themselves, expecting the usual display of dominance and aggression from their leader. When the doors opened, however, Dominic didn't enter alone. He walked in a half-step behind Maya. She wasn't wearing a server's uniform or a borrowed shirt. She was dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She didn't look like a student. She looked like a queen. Dominic pulled out the chair at the head of the table, not for himself, but for her. A ripple of shock went through the room. Elder Thorn, the same man who had insulted her at dinner weeks ago, stood up to object, his face flushing red. He demanded to know why an Omega was seating herself at the head of the War Council. Dominic leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, a dark, amused smirk playing on his lips. He didn't growl. He simply gestured for Maya to handle it. Maya didn't raise her voice. She placed a stack of files on the table and looked Thorn dead in the eye. She told him that while the Alphas had been busy measuring their egos, she had analyzed the pack's casualty rates. She revealed that 80% of their injuries were exacerbated by poor field medicine and lack of mental health support for enforcers suffering from feral fatigue. She announced that effective immediately, the new wing of the estate would not just be a clinic, but a rehabilitation center for traumatized shifters. She laid out a new budget that prioritized healing over warfare. She spoke with such clinical precision and undeniable logic that the room fell silent. She wasn't leading with claws, she was leading with wisdom. When she finished, she looked around the table, challenging anyone to disagree with the math. Thorn sat down slowly, deflated. One by one, the other elders nodded, murmuring their assent. They realized that while Dominic was the sword of the pack, Maya was the shield. She was the stability they had been desperate for. As the meeting adjourned and the elders filed out with newfound respect, Dominic walked over to where she sat. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the armrests of her chair, trapping her in his space. He kissed her forehead, his golden eyes shining with a pride that was blinding. He whispered that she was terrifying. Maya smiled, patting his cheek. She told him that someone had to be the adult in the room, and he was just lucky she was letting him stay up past his bedtime. Chapter 24. A New Leash on Life. 6 months later, the spring sun was shining brightly on the glass facade of the newly inaugurated Blackwood Center for Veterinary and Shifter Health. The waiting room was a chaotic, happy mix of local pet owners with their dogs and hardened pack enforcers waiting for their therapy appointments. Maya moved through the clinic with practiced ease, wearing a white coat with her name embroidered on the pocket. Dr. Maya Blackwood. She checked the chart of a golden retriever with a thorn in its paw, giving the owner instructions on aftercare, before moving to the reception desk to sign a stack of prescription refills. Life was busy, exhausting, and absolutely perfect. The bell above the clinic door chimed, and the sudden hush that fell over the waiting room signaled only one arrival. Maya didn't even look up from her clipboard as the heavy, rhythmic footsteps approached the desk. Alpha, Dominic Blackwood, dressed in a suit that cost more than the clinic's MRI machine, stopped in front of her. He looked imposing as ever, his sheer size making the reception area feel small, but the terrifying edge of his aura was smoothed over by a sense of deep, abiding contentment. He cleared his throat, trying to look serious, though his eyes were dancing with mischief. Maya finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. She asked him if he had an appointment. Dominic leaned over the counter, invading her personal space in a way that made the receptionist blush and scurry away to file papers. He held up his index finger, displaying a microscopic, barely visible paper cut. He told her it was a medical emergency. He claimed it was throbbing and that he might need stitches, or perhaps mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Maya rolled her eyes, fighting a smile. She told him he was ridiculous. She grabbed a neon pink Band-Aid from the drawer, the one with cartoon unicorns on it, and slapped it onto his finger with a little more force than necessary. Dominic looked at the unicorn Band-Aid, then back at her, grinning shamelessly. He lowered his voice, dropping it to that low, intimate rumble that still made her knees go weak after all this time. He asked if the doctor had any other prescriptions for him, perhaps something that required a private consultation in her office. Maya glanced around the waiting room, seeing the smiles on the faces of the pack members who were no longer afraid of their leader. She looked back at her mate, the blood wolf, who had learned to purr. She reached out, grabbing him by his silk tie, and pulled him down until their lips were inches apart. She whispered that she could squeeze him in for a 15-minute session, but only if he behaved. Dominic closed the gap, kissing her soundly in front of everyone, not caring who saw. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, and growled softly. He promised her he would never behave, but for her, he would always be a good boy. Maya laughed, the sound bright and free, as she led her Alpha toward the back office and locked the door.